mother came from Russia, a satchel on her knee. My grandfather had his father's cap he brought from Italy. They'd heard about a country where life might let them win. They paid the fare to America, and there they melted in.
America was full of opportunity for immigrants. Chinese began to come over in large numbers to provide inexpensive labor and to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. This became a problem for Americans because they began to compete with Chinese for jobs, and with nativism at a new high, the government had to step in. On May 6, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which suspended Chinese laborers' immigration for 10 years. Chinese already in America as of November 17, 1880, could stay, travel abroad, and return. However, the act prohibited naturalization of Chinese. On March 5th and 8th of 1897, a man named Wong Kim Ark was in the Supreme Court arguing his case. He was born in San Francisco, California, and claimed he was a citizen of the United States. After a few temporary visits to China, where he was allowed back into the U.S. based strictly on the fact that he was a natural-born citizen, he was refused and then restrained of his liberty against the Constitution and laws of the United States. The Supreme Court had to decide if Wong Kim Ark was excluded from the Chinese Exclusion Act. On March 28, 1898, the Supreme Court decided that Wong Kim Ark was a citizen and could be discharged. In 1907, the United States and Japan negotiated an agreement named the Gentlemen's Agreement. America wanted Japan to limit its immigration to the U.S. because people from California were afraid that the Japanese would depress their wages and take control of all the good farmland. Japan agreed to only issue passports to the U.S. to immigrants in certain categories of business and profession. In exchange for this, Theodore Roosevelt urged San Francisco to repeal the segregation orders and separate Japanese students from white students. 3 years later, Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay acted as an immigration center for Asians, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, Mexicans, Russians, and Central and South Americans. The immigrants had it a lot rougher than those who came from Europe. Most of them were isolated in wooden buildings of Angel Island based solely on appearance for health reasons and were processed there. Chinese immigrants were even detained and interrogated for weeks to months, and many were deported through the interrogation techniques. Sadly, in 1921, origin quotas were temporarily put in place to put limits on how many immigrants could come into the country based on origin. In 1924, the National Origin Act was established, making these quotas permanent in hopes of preserving the Northern and Western European influence already prevalent in America. 19 years later, in 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed because America became allies with China during World War II. And when the war had ended, America saw how many people overseas ended up displaced because of the Nazi government. In response to this, the U.S. passed the Displaced Persons Act on June 25, 1948. This granted permanent residency and employment without making someone give up their current job to anyone who was a victim to the Nazi government or was running from persecution. The act dealt directly with Germany, Austria, Italy, the French sectors of either Berlin or Vienna, or the American or British zone, and a native of Czechoslovakia. Post-World War II and after entering the Cold War, America took a huge step by passing the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the McCarran-Walter Act, on June 27, 1952. It excluded immigrants on the basis of being unlawful, immoral, diseased, or politically radical. In turn, it also focused on accepting those willing to assimilate into American culture. Although it did deny anyone associated with communism in the least because it was seen as a threat to the democratic system in place, and denied anyone from an enemy country from World War II, like Japan, the law didn't deal with race. This led to the passing of the Immigration Act of 1965, also called the Hart-Celler Act, on October 3, 1965. The act completely abolished the national origin quota system that had been in place for 44 years. It was replaced with a preference system that focused on immigrants' skills and their family relations. Immigration was no longer as much of a racial struggle. The debate of this matter is which time era was more harsh or racist towards immigration, the 1900s or the 1960s. Well, in the 1900s, all immigration laws up to 1948, when the Displaced Persons Act was passed, were based on race. And in the 1960s, despite the restriction on enemy countries in the Immigration and Nationality Act, laws became severely less racist. Finally, in 1965, they removed all national origin quotas, making race even less of an issue when immigrating to the U.S. There is also the diplomacy of immigration from 1900 to 1965. First, America was able to negotiate with other countries to make immigration better. The U.S. put national origin quotas aside for victims of World War II. Over time, the United States was able to focus less on national prejudice and more on national security. And mostly, they were able to abolish any limitation based on race.
The great American melting pot, the great American melting pot. What good ingredients, liberty and immigrants. They brought the country's customs, their language and their ways. They filled the factories to the soil, helped build the USA. Go on and ask your grandma, hear what she has to tell. How great to be American and something else as well. Lovely Lady Liberty with her book of recipes.